We are moving right along with our African food system transformation to address the SDGs. Franz, I believe that you and or Aldo will be chairing the session. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction and welcome, Max. We really appreciate. We're excited and look forward to participate and for the opportunity to offer this session on food security and agriculture, but specifically with a focus on food systems transformation in Africa to address the SDGs. The session will consist of two different sessions. The first session, I just want to share the screen here. The first session Session A consists of two panels. The first one conceptualizing the African food system, and the second one focusing on gender roles and the unequal status of women in African food systems in Africa. Following the first two panels, we will switch, and Aldo Strubel from the NRF, also a visiting fellow at the Institute for African Development at Cornell University, will take over as moderator for panel 1 and 2 in session B of our stream. If we look at this, it's very clear that food and agriculture is central to all 17 the Sustainable Development Goals. The focus obviously is clearly to emphasize and analyze the role of food and agriculture in this context. Why is it so important, and what would a transformed African food system look like? There's 4 important outcomes that we have identified for a transformed African food system. It would provide access to adequate amounts of safe, nutritious food, leading to improved food security, reduced malnutrition, addressing zero hunger, SDG 2. It will also make important contributions to public health, SDG 3, by reducing the burden of disease associated with malnutrition. It would be economically efficient and contribute to poverty reduction, wealth creation, and reduced inequalities, SDG 5 and 10, with a focus on gender. It would be environmentally sustainable, climate-smart agricultural practices widely adopted, SDG 13, and the food systems activities in a transformed system will also protect the biodiversity and the ecosystem as necessary and important elements of a functioning system, SDG 14 and 15, life on land and underwater. It would be characterized by sustainable consumption and production. We're all aware of all the losses, SDG 12, with a radical reduction along the whole value chain. To achieve these 4 interconnected outcomes, we need to deepen our understanding of the African food system and develop evidence-based interventions to bring about this transformation. If we just look at this again, you can see that there's 10 SDGs where food and agriculture have a direct impact in terms of achieving and moving forward with those SDGs. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, gender equality, land reform and fair access to rural land to reduce inequalities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, and life on land. And then finally, the importance of partnerships, which will be discussed and has been discussed in many different fora. So with this context and background, I would like to introduce the speakers and the panelists for session 1 to conceptualize the African food system. We have a keynote paper which will be delivered by Dr. Simeon Iu from the World Bank. He will speak to us about transforming Africa's food system. What would it take? That will be followed by a lead paper by Professor Julian May, who's the Director of the Center of Excellence in Food Security at the University of the Western Cape, and also the Director of the UNESCO Chair in the African Food System. The 3 panelists include Professor Jane Ambuko from the University of Nairobi in Kenya, Dr. Claire Quinn from the University of Leeds in the UK, and Professor Hetty Schoenfeld, who holds a Saatchi Chair in Food and Nutrition at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Finally, Dr. Stefano Maras, a consultant to the FAO and a senior postdoctoral fellow and researcher at the University of Pretoria, will provide a summary of this session. Without any further ado, I would like to ask Professor Simeon Eo to do his own screen share to start his keynote address. I just want to remind everybody that it's important, because of the virtual nature of this session, that we keep to time, that we share our own screen. The audience and participants who listen in must please use the question and answer function on Zoom to field any questions that we will, through the moderator discussion, direct to some of the panelists to respond to. The abstracts are available online, and we will have 2 comfort breaks of 5 minutes each between each one of the different panels. Thank you very much. Thank you, Simeon. Over to you.
Thank you, Franz. Let me try to see if I can share this screen. Let me take this opportunity to thank you, Franz, Aldo, and all the organizers for inviting me to this 8th World Sustainability Forum. As indicated by Franz, I will be speaking about transforming, African food systems and what basically it will take. Let me, first of all, our goal, vision, is to have a food system that is healthy, that provide an healthy economy, that is good for people, and also that's good for the planet. So we have, in terms of healthy economy, we're talking about ability to improve incomes of poor people, provide jobs, and be able to also provide secure and safe food and nutrition for the people, but also a food system that's good for the planet. That's our vision. Now, the question is, where do we stand in all this? Basically, in terms of the first pillar on healthy economy and healthy people and healthy planet, we are very much far from the target. We are off track. And I want to refer to what Franz showed earlier, that the food system is at the core of the SDGs. So by 2030, we are likely to meet the SDG goal. Also, in terms of food and nutrition, we still have millions of people globally who are going hungry. We also have malnutrition, in some cases, overweight and obese people. And in terms of healthy planet, we also have land degradation, water scarcity, the pollution, for example, in the Sahel region, biodiversity loss, and food waste and loss that was presented in the previous session. What does the picture look like for Africa? Just in July, the FAO WFP put up this map about the people who are undernourished in the world. And you can see that Africa is having the biggest share of undernourished people. Sub-Saharan Africa, 239 million people out of 258 for the whole of Africa. And in terms of acute food insecurity, we have 69 million people who are food insecure in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this number will double, okay, compared to 2019 because of the COVID situation. Now, the question is, in the absence of transformation in agriculture in Africa, the situation will worsen. At this moment, we are importing Africa, as of, if you take the data of 2015, some $35 billion in terms of import bill. By 2025, it's estimated that this bill will increase to over $100 billion. And on the graph on your right-hand side, you will see that for major commodities, the import growth is growing. And on here is the import bill. So it's quite high. So with this in mind, I would like to focus my presentation along three major points: the challenges and opportunities for a food system with a focus on global level and also Africa, the pathways for a change from agriculture to food systems, and what we are doing at the World Bank. In this graph, basically, oops, sorry, let me go back again, this is sensitive. In this graph, what we are showing is really the biggest challenge globally. By 2050,
bring me my iPad.
By 2050, we're trying to, globally, we want to be able to feed some 10 billion people. That is a huge challenge. But we have to be able to do that in a context where climate change is having an impact on the food system. The big question is how to live after poverty. The extreme poor who work in the food system. We only have 11 years to go to do corrective action, or we have some catastrophic environmental impacts. The Paris commitments are not enough. So adaptation to climate change will require major ramping up of agricultural research. Private sector investment will be needed. And more importantly, public support for agriculture should be aligned with the challenges of the global food system. And I will talk briefly about them. In this graph, what we're trying to show here is that we have a market value of global food system about 10 trillion. But if you count all the costs, the health cost, the environmental cost, the economic cost, and the food system, the net hidden cost, we have a total cost of about $13 trillion. So we don't even have a good balance by 2030. Let's look at Africa a little bit, how we are doing. And this is based on some McKinsey analysis of 13 sub-Saharan Africa. The analysis look at public agriculture expenditure as a share of total expenditure, agriculture budget allocated to effective enablers, share of budget allocated to actual dispersed, and those who are able to follow the CADEP strategies, the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program. You will see that as far as agricultural expenditure share of total public expenditure, out of the 13 countries, only 2 have over 10%. In terms of agriculture budget allocated to effective enablers, only 2. Same thing in terms of the use of the CADEP strategies that are basic, that are basic building blocks for moving agriculture. So we are far behind in terms of policies and engagement and public sector support. A bit more, this is based on work done by the African Union CADEP team. Over time, the public support to agriculture is actually declining. On your left side, you will see that in 2017, we had 20 African countries that were on track in green, and 27 countries were not on track. Now, 2019, there's a reverse. Only 4 countries are on track. Mali, even though they're in trouble now, Ghana, Morocco in case of North Africa, and one country that you don't see, very, very small, in Central East of Africa, which is Rwanda. But now we have 45 countries that are not on track. If you look at the impact, if you look at also the other criteria in terms of inclusive agricultural growth and transformation, again, 28 countries were on track and 19 not on track. Now you have 9 only on track, 40 member states that are not on track. So we're not doing well at all. We're actually declining in terms of the trend. Now, this is on the bad news side, but we also have a bright side. The bright side is that we have $1 trillion opportunity to transform African agriculture to satisfy food markets because of growing demands. If you look at the graph on the left side, you see that by 2030, we are going to have close to $1 trillion market compared to a base of 2010 of about 300 billion. So these are great opportunities that we can tap into. The public sector is a key enabler in this case to kickstart the process, shapehead its scale, and create enabling environment, assets, and conditions that can enable the private sector to make a difference. Now, the question here for us is, how can we go from agriculture to food systems that can leverage impact? So we need to be able to integrate the Malabo commitment into well-designed national agriculture investment plans, build capacity for evidence-based agriculture policy, prioritize initiatives to end hunger, and so forth. In this graph, basically, we present what I call the 10 critical multi-sectoral transitions that are needed to transform the food systems. Basically, what is showing is that focusing on agriculture per se alone is not enough. You need digital transformation, stronger rural livelihood. You need to address the question of gender and demography. We need to be able to diversify in terms of protein supply. You need to be able to reduce food waste and loss. And also, look at the local linkages, the loops, with the rest of the economy. They also focus on the environment side. It's very important. We need a healthy, productive ocean system, a protective a system that can also restore nature, the biomass that's degrading. We need to be able to also have an regenerative agriculture that can lead to healthy diet. So it's a complex web of systems that we need to work on, and one single bullet solution is not possible. It's multi-sectoral. Okay. Now, what will be needed for a successful transformation in Africa? Readiness is important. We need to be able to ensure that leaders are given the tools to do their job, like for training, analytics, mentorship, and decision-making structures. We need an agricultural transformation plan based on an agricultural strategy that can be focused and should not try to do too many things. We need to be able to avoid what we call broad range of programs and spreading funding too thinly, okay? And be able to deliver a program based on designated organizational structures to manage the transformation over time. We need to establish effective, extension and make use of digital tools. This is quite important. Again, in the same vein, we need public support that is smart, that's capable of providing information, define appropriate use of public financing to strengthen the capacity of countries to collect, process, analyze, and more effectively utilize the data. We need stronger institutions, support for infrastructure, like upgrade the logistical and physical, infrastructure supporting agriculture, and also incentive that can provide. We need to be able to provide incentive to farmers to be able to invest in climate smart agriculture, like having some smart subsidies type of approaches. We need to bring in innovations to be able to, that can help farmers to be able to scale up and produce at a higher yield than they are doing now. For example, the digital, the new technologies, and so on. Here are some of examples of how Africa can, farmers, we can up our game using ICTs. Simple examples. It's already in use in many places. For example, mechanization, be able to use Internet of Things for making mechanization work, using digital extension system, precision farming. In terms of market, it already exists. How can we scale up, like the Jumia type of approaches? And at the World Bank, we have what we call the Ag Observatory, which combines big data, artificial intelligence to connect millions of virtual, what we call meteorological stations to provide climate and moisture data for every 9 kilometers to be able to inform decision makers. And this is just a sample of ICT technology, ICT-based technology that can actually help to transform African agriculture. Now, what are we doing at the World Bank? Of course, we are just one player out of many, and relatively speaking, a small player, given the amount of resources that are available in different countries. Recently, we had a reflection on how we want to deal with the policy, food policy program and responses in context of COVID. And we look at it on 3 angles. On the food supply side, drivers, on the demand side, and also the market side. And we have 2 types of interventions, like the urgent ones, and also on the recovery side. For example, on the demand side, because food security is not just also on the supply side. How can we, help countries or people to have access to resources? Like we need to be able to have social protection and jobs program for people so that they can purchase the food. We need nutrition, health intervention. We need to be able to also expand, adapt institutional and purchases, for example, like for people who don't have access. In the supply side, We also, think about the strategic grain reserve for some people, but that's market-based. Look at the international and domestic trade market, and also retrofitting food system for new COVID-19 guidelines. And high frequency of monitoring of prices, macro, look at the macro policies, and look at the reduction in illegal or legal, food taxation. In the medium term, in terms of recovery, we need to be able to really provide support to countries. We are providing support to countries for ag and food supply reform, and also support SMEs and so on. So the options here are many, and each one of them can take a lot of time to discuss, but we are intervening in each of these areas depending on a country's situation. So the question is, what are some of the bold proposals that we are embracing? At the policy level, and this is not just in agriculture, we are working with our human development team to overhaul the ID system registries so that we would know who we are targeting. We are working with countries to reform policies on strategic food grain reserve and food aid. And we are also doing a lot of program investment where we are crowdsourcing agriculture and food disruptive technology solutions to countries. We are doing mid-sized agri-food financing with our IFC colleagues. We're also supporting local government, on food market standards and so on. On the advisory side, we are doing some high frequency monitoring of food prices, I mentioned that earlier, and then, mapping food systems to identify bottlenecks. So you can see that there are many issues many interventions that we are doing, but all these things, there's also cross-cutting issues. The issues of gender, youth, capacity building, and use of digital technology are cross-cutting that we are not ignoring and we are working on. This is one example of specifically what we're doing in West Africa in the Sahel zone, where, as you know, climate is having its toll on the food system there. We took some policy actions on food trade facilitation across key corridors in the context of COVID. We established a food crisis monitoring system. We are supporting a livestock market and trade, making adjustment to new standards. We are also providing support on institutional and physical regional capacity to improve, livestock, trade, because the Sahel is really a zone where livestock is produced and they move from east to west or north to south, grazing, and sometimes it provides conflict with the crop farmers. We're also providing some advisory services where we are mapping and developing strategic and regional value chain. And we are also providing support to regional crisis management of pastoralists in the Sahel. So many different interventions are taking place in the Sahel as example of intervention that we are having. The question is, for us, we had a conversation here at the World Bank just a month or two ago. What will it take to really transform agriculture in the Sahel? And here are examples of programs that we have. At this moment, we have investment in the order of $2 billion. But over the next 10 years, we estimate that we need $24 billion to be able to do those different interventions that we have. I have on the screen for you. So it calls for a lot of resources and money and coordination among different partners. At the World Bank, the agriculture and food is not working alone. For example, out of a program, we have while 60% of it is invested in agriculture and food, we work with environment, we work with the water global practice, we work with the urban, we work with the microfinance, and so on. So we do what we call multi-sectoral interventions. And all this call for a lot of coordination, just like what's happening in different levels at the country level. I mentioned partnership. We work, for example, with different partners at different levels. The African Union, in case of West Africa, the ECOWAS. We work with the European Union, the African Development Bank, research organizations like CIRAD, and so on. And so this is, for example, for the case of Sahel, what we're doing. And the kind of partnership that we are supporting. So longer term structural shift will be needed to be able to really have a healthy economy, healthy planet, and health for healthy people. These are three, I want to end this presentation with three key priorities. Be able to scale up public investment, do reform in institutions for market to work better, and undertake public policy and governance reform needed to be able to address all these issues that I mentioned earlier. These three, of course, buckets are critically important, but not enough, because in and of themselves, you have several actions that can be taken. This is where I would like to end my presentation, France, and I look forward to having further conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simeon. This was a very clear overview of the critical importance to transform the African agriculture and food system. You also elucidated with the appropriate examples that will really enhance the understanding of the components of the system, but especially the interactions between these components and ultimately the leverage points for food systems transformation. Thank you so much. Without any further ado, and in the interest of time, I'm going to ask Professor Julian May, which I have briefly introduced, to share his screen. He will focus on the conceptualizing the African food system, but with specific reference to the potential negative impact of COVID-19. Thank you very much, Julian.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Frans. So in this presentation, I'd like to dig a little bit further into some of the ideas that Simeon has already presented, because I think it's useful to go behind some of the concepts that we talk about when we're thinking about food system change to understand what quite are we talking about. And in particular, I want to think about how COVID-19 and the COVID-19 interventions are going to compel us to reimagine what risk is, both in terms of food security, and also in terms of food production. Okay, the first thing which I'd like to look beyond is what quite do we mean when we think of a food system? And here I've taken an idea which was prepared a decade or so ago to think about human development. So not the development of agricultural systems or farms, but how humans, and particularly children, are embedded in a series of interacting subsystems. This idea also plays in quite nicely with the UNICEF model of child development, whereby we can start to think who it is that we are focusing on when we are proposing changes to the food system. The diagram recognizes that individuals and households are at the hub of the system. They're our focus, they're the group that we are most concerned about. We could probably drill down further to think about what parts of a human are critical in absorbing food. What goes on, for example, in the gut that enables a child to absorb the nutrients effectively that we're feeding them. But that then individuals themselves purchase their foods from different kinds of food environments, which in some instances may be negative, they may be obesogenic, meaning the food that is available is high salt, high fat, high sugar. And so where you are able to obtain your food from and the nature of your immediate food environment has a lot to do with how humans are able to use food. And I've indicated there that is both the container, the movement of food from farms and from factories into urban areas, as well as the shops and the streets where people actually acquire their food. Surrounded that are the farms and the factories, which I think Simeon has spent quite a lot of time thinking about, what are the farms and how do we actually produce and process our food safely and in a way that we minimize waste. But around that then are the legal and institutional systems which enforce laws and ensure that rights are upheld. That itself is embedded in the political economy of the country and also in the globe, which determines who wins and loses when there are interventions. It also determines in whose favor markets work. Markets are not necessarily neutral, and typically markets may well favor those who have resources above those that do not. Then we have the sociocultural sphere, which are the preferences and tastes of people and how people like to interact with their food system. And then lastly, the biosphere, which I think Simeon has also spent a good deal of time describing the vulnerabilities of the biosphere in this current moment. So we see many different narratives about what Africa is perceived to be. And depending on what has been written about and who is writing it, Africa is either rising or Africa is, as one of the economists posts us as the hopeless continent. But in fact, there are dramatic changes taking place in Africa where African economies have performed better than many developed countries. And as we are seeing now with COVID, we're seeing greater resilience among Africa in terms of COVID infections. And even in the case of South Africa, for example, where COVID infection is as high as anywhere else in the world, much lower mortality rates. So Africa, in fact, is sitting in an opportune moment. And again, I think Simeon has pointed out those opportunities to be able to contribute more towards the global food system and to be able to better feed its own population. But also, as Simeon has cautioned, we are also seeing, we have not seen the progress which we would have hoped in terms of the investment of African governments in promoting the food system and in investing in the science and technology that African farmers so badly need. Instead, those resources are produced elsewhere and are not always well fitted to the environment in which many farmers find themselves. So Simeon also presented a chart which showed the increasing urbanization of Africa. And what I've tried to do here is also just drill a little bit underneath what we quite mean by urbanization. It's very easy to think of urbanization in Africa as being the movement of people from rural areas into the megacities of the continent. Cities such as Cairo or Luanda or Johannesburg, where already there are populations of greater than 10 million. But in fact, that's not what urbanization in Africa is all about. And considerably more people are moving into smaller cities and secondary towns. So the graph here sketches out the increase in population estimated by UNSTAT from 1993 to 2050. The bottom group are the people living in the mega cities, those cities which have populations of more than 10 million. As you see, that number does certainly increase, but compare that to people living in cities which have populations of less than 500,000. So we do need to start thinking about Africa's secondary cities and how secondary cities themselves relate to the immediate rural hinterlands. Several things may be happening. There could be a movement of people, of poor people into these areas, which simply is relocating rural poverty into smaller towns. This could lead to issues of labor shortages on farms where people have moved from, and it also could lead to the underutilization of farms in periods when there's high demand on labor. What we do know is that urbanization in Africa at the moment is not a one-way stream. People move between rural and urban areas, often returning when there is a need in the rural farm, and then going back to the urban area to seek income. But certainly what happens in urbanization is of very strong relevance both to food security more generally, but also what is happening on Africa's farms. Thomas Jane and others have shown that one of the mega trends in Africa is not necessarily about large land acquisition, but actually about the consolidation of land, which is held by relatively wealthier people in African countries. The question is, what do we do with the people that have been displaced from the land, and are we also generating unemployment, even at the same time as that we are generating greater agricultural productivity? So we need to think then, is Africa at some kind of demographic inflection point, some critical moment where the population change is going to be driving much of what's going on in Africa? So if we take, for example, one of those African megacities, Kinshasa, at the moment it's estimated that some 81% of the urban population lack access to improved drinking water, and up to 90% of the natural springs in the city are thought to be contaminated. Again, of direct relevance to food security, because this affects the safety within which food can be prepared, as well as leading to enteric infections of children, which limit their ability to absorb nutrients. Again, recall my earlier diagram where I said we need to place the human and the individual at the center of the food system. That image of resource pressure on all of Africa's cities continues across the board. And we will see huge increase in demands for electricity, as well as the demands to be able to power the devices that Simeon spoke about, which we hope will be able to bring a digital revolution in Africa as well. Here's another change which is important, and that is the change in the economic structure of Africa. The African Development Bank has done some estimates recently that talks to a growing middle class in Africa and compiles a set of statistics which show that this is not only about increased incomes, but also in terms of the lifestyles of an increasingly large number of people in Africa. So the African Development Bank is around 300 million people are in this $2 to $20 income band. And that entails then such as the increase in the use of smartphones and access to smartphones, the numbers of people who have mobile phones at all already starting to reach a saturation point in many countries. In South Africa, there are more mobile phones than there are people. Greater development of the financial sector, which brings both pros and cons as we might anticipate, greater financialization of the agricultural sector. And all of this drives issues of inequality in terms of inequality of wealth, assets, access to information. It is striking that 7 of the 10 world's most unequal countries can be found in Africa. We also talk about what changes are taking place that impact upon the food security. And one of the key ones are what we can think about as nutritional transitions, as the diets of the population of Africa also change. This can be seen in statistics. So this graph shows in the red line the changes in levels of overweight and obesity in Africa. So these are measures of overnutrition where people are consuming diets which provide them with more calories than they need, but not necessarily the nutrients that they require. And the blue line represents changes in child stunting. Here, a measure of chronic malnutrition that would take place in the womb and in the first 1,000 days of a child's life. In both instances, we see that overweight and obesity increases as the wealth of Africa increases. The horizontal line is gross national income per capita, and while stunting decreases. But what is also striking is that we have some outliers. On the graph, you will see that there is, on the blue graph, you will see there's a blue box that is unshaded. That represents South Africa, in which, despite its high levels of income, we have a level of stunting which is comparable to countries much poorer than South Africa. And this is not unusual to South Africa. We are seeing other African countries where wealth is increasing, but stunting, chronic malnutrition of children remains static and does not change. So these are nutritional transitions that we would think are undesirable and that we would like to see less increase in overweight and obesity, and how that relates to non-communicable disease, and improvements in child health as income goes up. I'll not spend much time on this, but Simeon also talked about the import of food into Africa. And in particular, what I wanted to draw to attention to here is that a quite substantial share of that food imports are food staples, the staples of wheat and of rice. This clearly is going to be an issue as the world's population grows, and certainly as the food crisis of 2008 showed, when a shock takes place in another part of the world that drives up prices, in this instance of rice, that Africa may find it difficult to import rice or has to import rice at high cost. Simon has also spoken to climate variability, and I think this, so I won't cover this slide in any detail, but certainly we are looking at the events in California at the moment show how climate change and environmental degradation are bringing about catastrophic events even in developed countries. If such fires were to occur in Africa, and in fact, if you look at a graph of the world's fires, such fires are already occurring in Africa, they're just not reported, then we are facing the similar kinds of crises that California is facing at the moment. And that brings me then to COVID-19. So at the moment, Africa is doing quite well in terms of the prevalence of COVID and in terms of the mortality of COVID. But we can certainly anticipate as Africa, with a connected food system such as Africa now faces, we are going to see changes as countries elsewhere in the world confront economic downturns and how these might impact upon the potential of Africa to export its crops. It's also likely to result in increases in the food that African countries have been importing. And lastly, the worry remains is the current low prevalence simply because we have been somewhat disconnected from other parts of the world? And can we anticipate to see other countries in Africa going the same way as South Africa, having to impose strict lockdowns, which had a dramatic impact upon economic activity and led to increasing poverty and increasing hunger? So a few things just to think about COVID and about a shock like COVID. Disease is typically an idiosyncratic shock. It impacts upon the individuals that become ill. But when you have a disease as widespread as COVID, and indeed as widespread as HIV/AIDS was in the past, it acts as if it's a covariate shock. It affects the entire community. So we need to start thinking about how do we deal with diseases that have community-wide impacts and not simply an impact on those that have the illness. We need to think about the livelihood shocks that result from those that die. Hasn't been too severe up until now, but also the morbidity, those that are ill and those that are having to take care of people who are ill, most likely women. We need to think about the unintended consequences of hard lockdown policies and how to mitigate those, particularly the preventing of movement and the limiting of economic activity. A deep concern in South Africa was during our hard lockdown, we did not permit the sale of food from informal traders, one of the key ways in which the poor people obtain their food in this country. We need to think about unintended consequences of mitigation interventions. What does it mean when we abruptly expand our social protection coverage or deliver food parcels? If we deliver food parcels, are we affecting local businesses? Ultimately, we were talking about balancing public health concerns versus growing agricultural livelihoods. And this is a two-way flow, which moves between the kinds of livelihoods that people have, how that affects their structural poverty, in other words, the assets that they have to be able to eventually build themselves out of poverty, issues of food inequities, and ultimately the role of livelihood shocks. Critical in all this is not only the science, but also the translational sciences that allow us to find solutions. The way in which we convert what is developed in laboratories or on our computers into meaningful policy and policy which is actually implemented. So what do we do? I think we're going to need to think about how to mitigate impacts of COVID-19 and public health policy on the efficiency and equity in food production and distribution. This means that we will need to look into changes along food value chains that have resulted from COVID-19 and the lockdown, the poverty of the stakeholders along the value chains, and issues around food prices and food quality and food safety. We need to think about promoting inclusivity to bring in other people who have been otherwise left out of the food system and improvements to the food system, and whose position may have in fact been worsened during COVID and COVID lockdown. This will include gender impacts, the impact of the youth who have not been able to get access to employment, the role of elderly who have been, in some instances, locked down and unable to communicate with those who normally would take care of them, as well as other marginal groups, including those who are disabled. Ultimately, I think we can anticipate that what has happened during COVID would have produced changes in inequalities, and we need to understand who was affected and who not. Lastly, we need to consider climate and ecological impacts that have been amplified or mitigated as a result of COVID and how we can respond to those. So it's an issue of reimagining risk. A useful chart has been prepared which identifies a whole range of risks that we know something about. The question is, how is COVID faring? And here we have to start thinking about what do we actually know about COVID prevalence, and particularly in countries with large populations. So those are the kind of issues that I wanted to bring into this panel for answer, and I'll end there.
Thank you very, very much, Julian. We took a little bit longer, but certainly thought-provoking strategic pointers of how to rethink or reimagine risk to guide our future thinking. I think it's an important contribution to frame the conversation for this afternoon. Thank you very much. We have three panelists participating. I've seen all three of them here, Jane, Claire, and Hetty. I want to ask them, or to just let them know, all three of you have your full 5 minutes. We will cut down a little bit on the conversation time. So without any further ado, Jane, can we start with you, please? Jane is from the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and the Arua Center of Excellence, hosted by the University of Pretoria, is co-hosted with the University of Nairobi in Kenya and the University of Ghana, Legon. Thank you, Jane.
Okay, so good afternoon all. I'm glad to be here this afternoon. I'm going to respond to some of the issues that have been raised in the previous sessions in the morning, and also what has been raised by Simeon. The focus of my brief response is on food loss and waste. So Simeon actually, regarding food system, he pointed out at three things. The vision of a food system that ensures a healthy economy, healthy people, healthy planet. And Franz, in your introduction, there's a fourth outcome of this session, or of the focus of the AFSNET project, regarding sustainable production and consumption, which is our SDG 12.3. So when we look at these visions and the desire or the SDG goals, we cannot have sustainable food systems when we have 30% of the food that is produced wasted along the supply chain without reaching the end user. And sadly, in sub-Saharan Africa, where majority are smallholder farmers, they're actually the people who bear the cost of these losses. Because when food is lost, income is lost. And I have worked with farmers, and I know the pain of losing food. You invest so much time, so much resources, and that food goes to waste. Now we see that when we look at food waste and losses, most studies point out the fact that most of the losses that happen, quantitative and qualitative losses, occur at the farm level. And this is attributed to poor post-harvest handling practices and lack of storage. Storage is a key word, is a major cause of losses. So for majority of the smallholder farmers, when you talk about storage, the production volumes, they do not give them it doesn't make economic sense for them to invest in some of the technologies that would recommend. For example, for horticultural farmers who for us in Kenya, horticulture is a major sector, and a lot of people are employed in the horticultural sector. And in horticulture, the losses are enormous, 40 to 50%. And much of this is attributed to lack of cold storage. So for individual farmers, cold storage is something out of reach, all right? So as an individual farmer, I would not think of investing in a cold room, because this is, it's beyond my reach as an individual farmer. But even for the farmers who are involved in production of non-perishables, the grains, again, while we have affordable storage that has been promoted over time in Kenya and in Africa, and I think globally, hermetic storage, that is there, yes. But still we have significant losses on the farm, at the farm level, because even with this kind of storage, the storage, with these technologies like hermetic storage or hermetic bags, the conditions are not optimal. So you find you still have grain that is not dried properly, then it's stored in a place that has, vermins like rats. So hermetic storage will still not work. So that means even with technology, still there's more that needs to be done, all right? So when I go back to what Julian just presented, and I picked a statement about translational science in finding solutions. This is what we've been trying to do at the University of Nairobi, and I know this is going on with many groups. So from our research and experience working with smallholder farmers, we propose and we have tested the fact that one strategy that could help address these challenges is village aggregation centers. Now, for perishables, village aggregation centers would be something like a center owned by farmers, equipped with cold storage technologies. Now, how does this work? Now, farmers who are organized. Like I said, the farmers, their volumes, the production is too little to warrant some of the technology, to warrant investment in some of the technologies that are required. So, but farmers who are organized in groups and have this cold storage can actually aggregate the small volumes of produce to attain the quantities, to attain the qualities, and the consistency that is demanded by traders or off-takers. So when you work backwards with the traders, you ensure that whatever is aggregated meets the quality or the demands of the market, which is targeted by the aggregator. Now, to do this, the group members, the members who are organized in groups can be trained, are trained on proper production practices to optimize quality at harvest and good post-harvest handling practices to preserve that quality. Now, this strategy, I'm talking about this strategy because it has worked. It has worked in one place, and I think it can work across others. Now, this strategy, we've tested it in Kenya with working with mango farmers and a project called Yieldwise, which was supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, in this project, smallholder farmers, mango farmers who are organized in group own an aggregation center. It is an aggregation center equipped with cold storage technologies and simple processing technologies. Now, they are able to aggregate their mangoes. In this case, it's mangoes, but it can work for other produce. So they are able to aggregate mangoes and target off-takers or target the market. While they are organized in this group, unlike when they operate as individuals, they are actually able to negotiate better prices for their commodities, and so they're not forced to sell, as is usually the case, because foods or commodities like fruit and vegetables are highly perishable. So when you harvest, you've got to sell. So that's why they are taken advantage of by traders. But with this kind of facilities, smallholder aggregation, they are able to store. If they cannot sell, they can still store and wait until the market is right or the prices are okay. But even then, with small-scale processing facilities, they are able to transform their produce into shelf-stable products and therefore minimize losses at the farm. That works. That is strategy for those who are dealing in perishables. Now, strategy for those who are doing grains or non-perishables. Again, in Kenya, we have this model has worked in some regions where we have village aggregation centers. Now, these are equipped with simple equipment for primary processing. This we are talking about shellers, dryers, moisture meters, aflatoxin testers. These at this kind of center, then you are able to ensure the produce meets basic quality before storage, and at the center you have appropriate storage environment, technologies and environment that is dry for grains. So when farmers do not have on-farm storage, which is the case with many farmers, they produce, but where they store is a challenge. So those who do not have on-farm storage, they are not forced to sell, because that is what happens. They're forced to sell their grain immediately after harvest because they do not have storage. But when this grain can be aggregated, yes, and then the aggregators make some partial payment to the farmers who deliver the grains to the aggregation centers. This would help them to meet their immediate financial needs, but the grain is actually stored for them in a safe condition until, and at safe and optimal conditions until the market prices are fair. Now, this works in the sense that really one of the challenges, yes, I'm finishing. Yes, okay. One of the challenges we have is that farmers, especially for grains, which is our staples, they face a vicious circle where they sell their grains immediately after harvest, and then a few months later, they're forced to buy the same grain at a higher price from traders. So with this kind of aggregation centers, it has been shown that actually they can aggregate store their produce and then be able to the produce can be sold on their behalf at a fair price. Now, in conclusion, reduction, I'll just have to say that reduction of post-harvest losses is critical in our goal to attain sustainable food systems. And we know we have set targets under SDG 12.3 to have these losses by the year 2030, and under Malabo Declaration to have by the year 2025. Now, what I've just shared are some of really practical and tested strategies that can actually contribute to this goal of reducing losses and enabling farmers to access markets and improve their income and livelihoods. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jane. We go over to Claire Quinn from the University of Leeds. She's my co-director for the Food Systems Research Network for Africa. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Franz. And I kind of want to take my comments today coming from FSNet Africa and that programme which is looking to expand and support research on African food systems. And what I want to pick up in particular is this idea of systems that Julian talked about in his presentation. I think a food systems approach is one that obviously recognises the importance of interactions and relationships within the system, so between activities and actors. So the systems approach really recognises the importance of taking, in research terms, an interdisciplinary approach to understanding our food, where it comes from and where it goes to, and how it does that. We can't just look at agriculture, we can't just look at sociology, we can't just look at transportation or so on. We need to look at those things together and the interactions and relationships between them. So that kind of systems thinking and systems type approach enables us to consider complexity. It enables us to consider contrasting perspectives within the food system. And it also enables us to look at things like uncertainty, as well as agency, power, and knowledge within our food systems. I think there are some significant challenges in implementing large-scale research on complex food systems in Africa. And one of those critical challenges is because we, as yet, haven't developed a contextual and comprehensive conceptualization of our food system in Africa and how it is similar or different from other food systems globally. We have, and many of you will have seen diagrams looking at food systems at that kind of broad global level. But I think we lack that understanding at a continent level for African food systems. And I think having something and a really good conceptualization of what African food systems are, I think is really important. Because while they will have many similar activities and actors to our global models, I think there will also be activities and actors and conditions which are context specific to African food systems. So we, within the FSNet Africa project, as a first step, are trying to develop a regionally focused conceptualization of what an African food system looks like, to try and then identify what the research gaps are, where the potential leverage points are for transformative change, and where we can focus our efforts in terms of highlighting where efficiencies might come, where safety can be improved, where resilience can be built in. How do we make a food system more inclusive? How do we deal with issues about affordability and access, and making sure that the food that's produced within an African food system is nutritious? So we're starting to build this conceptualization, and that conceptualization recognizes the importance of gender and poverty as cross-cutting issues in African food systems. They influence labor, inputs, the types of farming systems that happen on, so all of those supply side questions, but also diets and food cultures on the demand side of our food system. Our conceptualization is also recognizing that there are formal and informal supply chains in African food systems. And so both produced and foraged food moves through these formal and informal parts of the system, and different actors are engaged in all parts of those supply chains, but those supply chains also interact and interact in particular ways. Again, this links back to what Julian was talking about in terms of informal markets and those who tend to be poorer accessing food through informal markets. So it's really important that our conceptualization of what African food systems are incorporates those aspects. And we're also recognizing the kind of emerging actors, the agripreneurs within African food systems who are setting up businesses within that sector. So we are trying to conceptualize African food systems so that we can develop evidence-based interventions in our research around nutritious food, inclusive systems, and sustainable and environmental approaches to transforming the African food system. And I hand back to you, Franz.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was a very clear overview explaining the FSNet Africa approach in terms of a response to the new conceptualized framework. Our next panelist is Professor Hetty Schoenfeld. She holds a South African Research Chair in Food and Nutrition at the University of Pretoria. She's also a co-director of the Arua Center of Excellence in Food Security and directing a big program on partnerships with a focus on nutritious food choices in African food systems. Thank you very much, Hetty.
Thank you very much, Franz, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute today. I'm going to take a little bit more, a deeper dive into nutrition in this context. I think one of the things that we've learned in the recent past is that nutrition and food systems and food has never been so much in the media as now. This despite the fact that we know that nutrition is essential to achieve the sustainable development goals, just as the food is. And particularly if we look at food-based approaches, we know that it's recognized as the most effective strategy to address malnutrition, including dietary diversification, improved food availability and affordability, and the nutrition-sensitive agriculture and education. But we know that diverse foods are limited today. A mere 30 crops supply 95% of the calories that people obtain from food. And some of the crops that were mentioned already, maize, rice, wheat, and potatoes, supply over 60%. And 5 ingredients, namely refined flour, sugar, soy, palm oil, and high fructose corn syrup, appear over and over again in a huge range of different products. So what appears like varieties in many instances just endless re-engineering, recombining, and repackaging of the same basic, highly processed ingredients. And this comes at a cost, with the rising consumption of ultra-processed foods, all contributing, as Julian has mentioned, to the global epidemic of overweight and obesity and diet-related non-communicable diseases, and particularly so in Africa. So our focus needs to change from energy such as was in the 70s to enough nutrients. And we know that the diets of the poor in developing countries usually consist of very high amounts of these staple foods, with very few micronutrient-rich foods such as fruits and vegetables and animal products. And according to the Bureau of Food Policy and Agriculture Healthy Food Baskets that was released a month ago, diverse foods are unaffordable to a large part of the society. At an income decile of 5, only 35, only then are individuals able to afford a thrifty, healthy basket. And which now during lockdown, we know that up to 87% of all income in the family has gone to food, which is a real, raises real questions about sustainability. So what should we do to improve the physical and economic access to healthy and sustainable diets? First of all, we have to adopt in-country policies and programs to increase nutritional value, such as micronutrient fortification, biofortified staple crops. We need to subsidize healthier food choices and decrease less healthy ingredients. And if we think about that, there's many policies that are introduced by countries now to decrease trans fatty acids, sodium reduction regulations, and also to make unhealthy foods more expensive. And I think sugar tax is one of those that were really taken up by many countries. The second priority is to strengthen consumers' information and education to enable healthier food choices. Nutrition education should be in school curricula, and it should be taught at prenatal and antenatal clinics. We know that FAO, or the Food and Agricultural Program, has encouraged many countries and assisted them in developing food-based dietary guidelines, which should form part of mass media campaigns to lead to behavior-changing interventions. And we should increase the awareness of the nutritional advantages of indigenous and underutilized crops or wild foods, and also promote traditional food culture and preparation techniques. And with that, I would like to thank you.
Thank you very much, Betty, for that overview. I think it really emphasized the importance of food and nutrition and how to guide nutritious food choices in diets in terms of transforming the African food system. I've seen there's a very lively debate going on with questions where people are responding to answer also at the same time, but we have a couple of minutes for a moderated discussion. I wonder whether we should do it that way or perhaps ask Stefano Maras to do the 10-minute summary for us at this stage, and then following that, following that I will ask each one of the speakers to make a final comment. I think that's the best under the circumstances, because most of the questions that were posted has been responded to by either the keynote speaker or the lead paper speaker, Julian, or the panelists. So with your agreement then, Stefano, I will ask you to do a 10-minute summary for us of this session, conceptualizing the African food system in the context of the broad overview that Simeon has provided, Julian, who came in specifically with a focus on post-COVID-19, and then the examples and the responses made by Jane, Claire, and Hetty. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists for the very good presentations. Thank you, Franz, for having me here to summarize this very, very interesting session. Instead of summarizing, actually, I think it would be more interesting to take a key aspect from all the presentations, somehow that thin line that connects all the five presentations, actually, including Simeon. And I think that the key aspects that we should highlight, because they were all addressed by all presentations, are the role of private sector, as Simeon has pointed out, the importance of supporting private sector-led transformation, to take the private sector not just as an actor that on which we overimpose policies, but to listen to the private sector, be it small, medium, or large scale. And on the small scale, I would focus more. And I think that to build a resilient and sustainable food system in not just in Africa, but in general, globally, we really need to listen, to look at, and to leverage the small-scale businesses. Like Jane was telling us about the small aggregation centers with cold hubs, using also simple processing technologies. So simplicity, use of simple technologies, the small scale are two key concepts. And also to make unhealthy food more expensive. Hattie was pointing out this important thing that policy makers should consider that would actually support indirectly horticultural producers, small producers, because as we know, most of the unhealthy food is highly processed food, which is basically produced and sold by large companies, multinational companies. So to support small scale private sector directly and indirectly through creating the right environment, policy environment to provide them with the possibility to produce what actually they think is better to be produced because of the local demand. For instance, I do not really agree with Simeon's or the World Bank's when they propose to focus on a preset of commodity value chains. I personally think that is in contrast with the privately led transformation, especially if we look at small scale private companies or small scale agripreneurs, as Claire called them. I would like to close this, let's call it summary, with a tale. Let me share my screen. And I think that this tale summarizes well all these concepts and what I think we should do to build a resilient and a resilient food system. So let me share. Okay, great. So the three little pigs. Once upon a time in 2017 in Malawi, Joseph Godwey, a young farmer, started Chima World, raising natural pigs with no hormones, antibiotics, or animal feeds. He sold porkers, 8 to 12-month-old pigs, to off-takers who then sold to supermarkets for their higher income consumers who loved lean meat. He earned $100 per porker and made a profit of about $540 in 3 months. Then one day the COVID-19 came and supermarkets limited their activity and off-takers froze purchases from Chima. Pigs grew older each passing day, and Chima started selling them anyway to vendors at just $55 each, making no profit in 1 month. But then Joseph decided to sell weaners, 2 to 3 months old pigs, to middle-income people who feared losing their jobs and may decide to raise pigs as an alternative income source. He used social media to advertise products, gave free online lectures on pig production, and organized free delivery for customers in lockdown. One day, the Catholic Development Commission in Malawi was looking for a weaner supplier for a livelihood project. They found Chima on social media and they started buying in bulk. By selling weaner at just $33 each, Chima was able to increase its profit to $715 in 3 months. Moral of the story: to help create resilient and sustainable food systems, let's be inspired by bottom-up, small-scale, find them, communicate them, and try to transfer them, or at least to make them transferable. This story was from G. Frost in White Hart with the IFAD support. I think it's a very interesting story that tells us what is really important when we do both research and development. It's to go on the ground, to look for inspiring stories that really can change the life of thousands of people involved, engaged throughout the whole value chain. That is just an example. Another example, I can't remember who was talking about students going to the fields to get the produce that was going to waste, and they took it and they made fruit juice out of that. So that's another example. No cost, very simple, very very simple, as they said. So it's important to have all these projects backed with the money of World Bank or other organizations. It's as important to not think of money, but just think of ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Stefano, for that wonderful overview and summary and the very enlightening and entertaining story of the three peaks. I've indicated that most of the questions that were fielded in the question and answer or chat functions has been responded to by the panelists and the speakers. So in the last 5 minutes before we conclude, I will ask each one which were in my panel or in this panel to make a final concluding comment. We will start with you, Julian, please.
Frans, I'll probably take less than 2 minutes, because I think the one thing I would want to raise is, if we are recognizing that transforming the agricultural food system, the food system of Africa, is complex and multidimensional, what do we gain by then trying to come up with solutions that are simple? It's a question that was posed by Peter Sonderbaum, who's a quite well-known Swedish ecological economist. And it points to the fact that we tend to want to respond to these complex problems, both disciplinary specific approaches or approaches which are suitable to a particular department in the government. And they're not likely to work, given that, as I think all speakers have agreed, we are dealing with complexity. And so necessarily we're always going to be seeking imperfect answers, trying interventions. I think one of the main things we should be thinking about is, how do we build learning and experimentation into our policy interventions on a continuous basis? And it applies to food security, and it applies to many other things. The last comment is also just to think how we need to think how our perceptions of certainty have changed with COVID. Someone remarked to me 5 years ago, when they asked you the question, where do you think you're going to be in 5 years' time? No one on the planet would have gotten that question, the answer to that question, correct. So we really have seen the most remarkable event in the last 6 months, and we're likely to see more of them. So we do need to be planning about quite profound uncertainties compared to what we have had in the past. I'll stop there, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julian. Claire?
Thank you, Frans. I think my first thing is in support of Julian's comments. I think it's really important for us to make sure that we don't fall into silos, that we don't fall into standard ways of thinking, and that, you know, that when we're thinking about food systems, that we think about bringing together different disciplines, different ideas, different approaches to try and understand what's happening and why. So I would definitely be in support of that. I think what's also critical is thinking about transformation. We talk quite a lot about transformation of food systems, but what does that mean in reality? What kind of transformation are we really thinking about in terms of our food system, and how might we go about that? And I think part of that thinking about transformation, I think, links to what Stefano was talking about in terms of looking at the examples that we can see in food systems of individuals, organizations, aspects of the food system transforming in response to stress. And I think COVID will provide lots of examples, and I know my own experience of examples here too, where under the impact of COVID-19, we've seen individuals, organizations, aspects of the food system really transform in response to it, and really do things differently. And so I think there's a huge amount that we can learn from those things that are going on at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire. My apologies, I was muted. Hetty, your final comments, please.
So I think without good health, food security and nutrition, development in general is unsustainable. And I totally agree with Julian that food systems is complex, and I think we all agree today that it is not nutrition or food driven. So, but very much by agricultural production and income generation. And we have to learn to leverage the whole food system as an underutilized policy response. Thank you.
Thank you, Hetty. And then finally, Jane.
Okay, so I think for me, the parting shot would be the fact that the smallholder farmer is at the center of the African food system. And I know over the years, we from research, we have focused a lot on the production side, finding solutions to the challenges to production. So we need to also, together with that, ensure that whatever is produced gets to the market, because the losses of food along the chain translates into lost income for the farmers. So while we look for solutions to production, we also must look for affordable and appropriate solutions to what happens to the food after production. And like I said in my presentation earlier, lost food means lost income for the farmers. And since we've given ourselves we've given ourselves to address some of the SDGs on sustainable consumption, sustainable production and consumption, SDG 12. While we address that, if we can just tackle, as we do production, we tackle the issue of food loss and waste, we'll be doing greater good to the farmers, because it addresses, as we reduce losses, we also address other SDGs, SDG 1, SDG 2, SDG 3, and the one on climate change, SDG 13, and others. So I think food loss and waste reduction has very many other benefits to it. So we need to really, address that problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you very, very much to the whole panel. I think you would all agree with me that we've started to unpack and move forward on the 4 outcomes that we mentioned in the beginning, to provide access to adequate amounts of safe, nutritious food, leading to improved food security and reduced malnutrition, and that it will also make important contributions to public health and reducing the burden of disease. Also to be characterized by sustainable consumption and production with a radical reduction in food loss. The next session will focus on economically efficient systems contributing towards poverty reduction and reduced inequality with a focus on gender. So we conclude this session. I want to thank you all most sincerely. We take a 2 or 3 minute comfort break, and then we will start with a session focusing on gender. Thank you very much.